completely, right? I mean, your echoes are coming while you are speaking. Eat something, yeah, that's what I want to tell you. Yeah, milk or something, yes, drink or eat something. Yeah, because you need energy also at this time, na, to take care of all these things.
Prabhuji, I'm unable to listen, hear your voice.
Sorry?
Yeah, now I can hear, yes. Earlier, I could not hear.
Okay, let's start then. ॐ अज्ञानतिमिरान्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपा कथा मह्यं ददति स्वपदान्त वन्देहं श्रीगुरो श्रीयुताकमलं श्रीगुरु वैष्णवांश्च श्रीरूपं साग्रजातां गणरघुनाथान् राम सजीवं साद्वैतं सहितं चैतन्यदेवं पादान् सह गणललिता श्रीविशाख अन्वितांश्च नमो भगवते भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामिने नमस्ते सारस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेषा शून्यवादी पाश्चात्यादेशतारिणे वंशकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्येव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण। Can you hear me better now or?
Yes, Prabhuji, can hear.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna
Krishna.
Prabhuji, Hare Krishna.
Okay. Can you please let me know if you can see the screen and then we will start.
Yes, Prabhuji. Yes, Prabhuji, we can hear you.
Radhika Mataj, I can't hear you. I don't know.
Hare Krishna.
Now is it better? You can hear me, but I can't hear you. Okay, let me start at least. Okay, reading from Śrīla Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta, Volume 1, Chapter 5. The War. Under the circumstances since 1936 up to now, I was simply speculating whether I shall venture this difficult task, and that without any means and capacity. But as none have discouraged me, I have now taken courage to take up the work. Srila Prabhupada, Back to Godhead Magazine. The fire in the mutt broke out almost immediately. A senior disciple said that there should be one Acharya who would be the spiritual successor to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and who would perform all initiations and settle all controversies. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had never said that. He had never called for one Acharya. Rather, he had instructed the members of Gaudiya Math to form a governing body of 12 men and carry on a concerted effort. But that instruction was abandoned, and the suggestion that there be one leader took hold. A single person instead of 12 should take charge, and now it became a rush for who. Two parties contested. Ananta Vasudev, one of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's leading preachers, was ambitious and he pressed his claim with a group of influential sannyasis supporters. Another man, Kunja Vihari, shrewdly went after the properties. He had been a leading administrator under Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and now he claimed ownership of the palatial temple in Calcutta as well as all the other properties and assets of the India-wide Gaudiya Math. Although in his will, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had expressed his desire that his disciples select a governing body to manage all properties and funds of the Gaudiya Math, Kunja Vihari contested the will's legitimacy. He and his supporters argued that since Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had received the properties on behalf of God, he was not their rightful owner and therefore could not determine their full ownership. Thus he and others disputed over the legal and theological aspects of the former Acharya's position. Shortly after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's passing away, litigation had begun. Ananta Vasudev, supported by a majority of members of Gaudiya Math, had claimed that he, as the next Acharya, was the owner and director of the properties. But although Kunja Vihari had only a few supporters, he defied the majority by pressing his claim through lawyers in court. Kunja Vihari and his men had possession of the Chaitanya Math and the temples in Mayapur. Vasudev's party captured other buildings. Quarreling and fist fightings broke out. The preaching of the Gaudiya Math stopped. Abhay's inability to take part in the activities of Gaudiya Math was suddenly in his favor. He had always been more a visitor than a member at the Math, and at least externally, more the Grahastha businessman than a missionary worker. This automatically put him at a distance from the fray. Of course, he was associated with the Math in Bombay and Allahabad, but he had no managerial position, no claims to ownership, and no role in the litigation. Nor did he desire to take sides in the struggle for power. Like many of the other disciples, he was mortified to see that his spiritual master's instruction for cooperation had been disregarded and his mission thrown into a legal dispute. Abhay knew that Srila Bhakti Siddhanta had wanted the leaders to work cooperatively, and so he could not sympathize with the warring factions. Both parties were an insult to Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. But he wanted to preach. Although becoming a very good English preacher was something he was meditating on more than actively doing, the Gaudiya Math would logically have been the vehicle for his preaching. He had already contributed articles to the Gaudiya Math's publications and had been working with his godbrothers at the Allahabad and Bombay centers. Naturally, he thought of serving his spiritual masters in terms of serving within his spiritual master's mission. But the Gaudiya Math, which had always been known for pure, bold preaching of the message of Lord Chaitanya, was now becoming known for embroiled factions. As the Gaudiya Math broke down, he was also affected. Under the present circumstances, how could he carry out his spiritual master's order to preach? Previously, the main obstacle to his preaching had been family commitments, but now the obstacles were compounded. Now he had to wait helplessly for the outcome of this struggle. What would Krishna bring about? 1938, his Bombay business diminishing. Abhay, now 42, moved back to Calcutta with his wife and family and rented a house at 6 Sita Kanta Banerjee Lane. The street was but a narrow lane, lined on either side with three-story houses. His office was on the first floor facing the street. The family lived upstairs. He rented the adjoining building, number 7, and on the first floor operated a small chemical laboratory manufacturing distilled water, days pain, liniment, Vimal tonic, alpha, an injection for boils, and various other medicines. He also utilized a small outbuilding in the rear as part of his lab. Out front he hung a large signboard, Abhay Charan De and Sons, displaying a picture of a mustached Abhay Charan. Sometimes he would employ 2 or 3 servants to assist him, but mostly he worked alone. And he would deliver his glass jugs of distilled water to agents such as Bengal Company and Gluconet. He printed a brochure advertising Day's pain liniment, good for relieving gout, rheumatism, and all pains. And if one wanted to be free of recurring diseases like rheumatism and gout, Abhay's brochure directed that in addition to using Day's pain liniment, one refrain from alcohol and all sorts of drinking or intoxicating habits, and food and drink should be very simple and innocent, such as vegetable and milk. The new Calcutta business enjoyed an early success, but Abhay didn't have his heart in it. It was a duty; he had to do it to maintain his family. His new acquaintance in Calcutta found him to be a devotee of God at heart, a businessman, a family man, but more concerned with writing and preaching than with business and family. Shandi Mukherjee, a neighbor from nearby Bihari Street, he was interested only in devotional activities and he did his business only to maintain the family. He didn't seem interested in profit motive, in accumulating money or becoming a rich man. Charan Mukherjee, Abhay's next door neighbor. Abhay Charan De was always a very patient listener to every illogical argument that anybody, including myself, would bring to him. Not knowing philosophy, I would illogically present so many arguments, and Mr. De would always very patiently listen. Nothing agitated him. He was always very calm, and he taught me about God. He would speak only of Krishna. He was translating the Gita and was maintaining his business. Neighbors would often see him sitting on his cot in the front room. He would read his spiritual master's books and sometimes recite the Sanskrit slokas out loud. He liked to discuss philosophy with anyone who came by. His family keeping mostly upstairs, Abhay would sit alone in the downstairs front room, dressed in dhoti and kurta, or sometimes a dhoti and only a vest. Often he would be at his writing, while outside the door his children played with the children of the Ganguly family who lived in the rear apartment of the same building. The neighbors lived openly in a kind of joint neighborhood family, and Abhay talked freely with the other neighbors, but of Vaishnava philosophy and only rarely of business. Mr. Ganguly found Abhay's speech scholastic and always very philosophical. Abhay was absorbed in the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, and even in brief conversations he would refer to Lord Krishna and to Bhagavad Gita's description of Lord Krishna as the basis of both the material and spiritual worlds. While working in his laboratory or receiving a delivery of empty bottles from the Muslim bottle merchant or going out to sell his medicine, he would be talking or thinking about God. In those days, for a person in Calcutta to be interested in God consciousness was not so unusual. Abhay would Abhay found even a man like Abdullah, the Muslim bottle merchant, to be very religious. One day Abhay asked Abdullah, who had once been very poor but had become rich by his business, now you have got money. So how are you going to use your money? The bottle merchant replied, my dear sir, I have an intention to construct a mosque. Meanwhile, the war of the Gaudiya Math raged on. Both factions were ill-motivated, and both deviated from the instructions of their spiritual master. The very act of trying to determine ownership of the properties through legal action meant that the God brothers were disobeying the express desire of their spiritual master, as stated in his will. The litigation continued year after year, but the legal wrangling could not bring them together or purify them. One court ruled in favor of Ananta Vasudev, but then a higher court awarded two-thirds of Mutt property to Kunja Vihari and one-third to Vasudev. Still, Still, although Vasudev had fewer properties, he inspired more followers. He seemed to be to them more intent on reviving the preaching of Gaudiya Math. But when Vasudev subsequently fell down from the principles of sannyas by going off with a woman, the groups broke further to pieces. Most of the sannyasis continued to maintain their principles, but many now left the jurisdiction of the two contending factions in disgust. Individuals formed their own ashrams, Gaudiya Mission, Chaitanya Gaudiya Math, and others. The unified entity of Gaudiya Math as an all India mission consisting of many temples, several presses, and hundreds of devotees working cooperatively under one leadership ceased to exist. God brothers continue to uphold the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as they have received them from Śrīla Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. But because they were meant to work together, they lacked their former united potency. Illusions of proprietorship and prestige have had superseded the spiritual master's order, and Śrīla Bhakti Siddhanta cause a worldwide movement for propagating Lord Chaitanya's teachings collapsed. Wherever Abhay went to, he seemed to attract the company of his god brothers. Some followers of Sridhar Maharaj, the same Sridhar with whom he had worked in Bombay and whom he had always regarded as a good devotee and scholar, met Abhay at his place on Banerjee Lane and told this news to Sridhar Maharaj, who was then living at his own ashram in Mayapur. Sridhar Maharaj had disaffiliated himself from the factions of Gaudiya Math, but as a sannyasi, he was still preaching and was interested in publishing Vaishnava literature. He had wanted to maintain an ashram in Calcutta, so for 20 rupees a month he rented from Abhay the 4 rooms on second floor of number 7 above Abhay's chemical laboratory. Now, whenever they came to Calcutta, Sridhar Maharaj, Puri Maharaj, and Bhakti Saranga Maharaj based themselves there, staying in small separate rooms. He became a regular ashram for sanya. It became a regular ashram for sannyasis and brahmacharis, and Sridhar Maharaj put a sign out front, Devananda Saraswati Math. Sridhar Maharaj's establishment of a mutt in Mayapur with a branch in Calcutta was his response to Gaudiya Math's split. Like other sannyasis, he had been initiating disciples and preaching, not waiting for the outcome of litigation with its continued appeals and counterclaims. Abhay was glad to encourage Sridhar Maharaj and the others who joined him at his little ashram. Here Abhay and Sridhar Maharaj and his followers could remain aloof from the warring factions and together pursue their plans for spreading Krishna consciousness. The sannyasis cooked in their separate kitchen, performed their puja, and held morning and evening kirtans and lectures. Abhay remained with his family, taking his own meals and performing his own puja, but he often went to discuss Srimad Bhagavatam with Sridhar Maharaj. From his roof, Abhay could see the towering steeple of his spiritual master's building, the Gaudiya Math of Bagh Bazar, its ownership now contested by bitter factions. Abhay would often accompany Sridhar Maharaj and his assistants at preaching programs where he would play the mridanga. And when Sridhar Maharaj fell ill, Abhay led the other devotees on preaching engagements, performing kirtan, playing mridang, and giving lectures on the Bhagavatam. Sridhar Maharaj says, "We did not see Abhay as working very hard for making money, nor did he seem very rich or to have a lot of liquid funds. He was attracted more to the spiritual side of affairs than to his family affairs. He never discussed business prospects with me, whether the business was up or down, or whether he was planning to do this or that. Monetarily, he did not have sufficient funds for giving any to the mission." Abhay began to think seriously about writing Vaishnava literature. His spiritual master had seemed very pleased and had told the editor of the Harmonist, "Whatever he writes, publish it." Business profits, if he could somehow expand them, could go for printing books in English, as his spiritual master had said. If you ever get money, print books. Certainly the Gaudiya Math was not going to do it. Kunja Bihari had sold Bhaktisiddhanta's printing presses to offset his legal expenses. No, Abhay would have to continue on his own, maintaining his business and simultaneously trying to write and publish. And that was also the prescription of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta. It is better that he is living outside your company. When the time comes, he will do everything himself. It was in 1939 that Abhay wrote Introduction to Gita-Upanishad. It was a short piece, but it signaled his intention to take on the task of one day translating Bhagavad Gita into English with commentary. Of course, there were already many commentaries in English, but most of them had been written by impersonalists or others who had not delivered the original spirit of the Gita, the spirit of Arjuna, on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, hearing Bhagavad Gita directly from Lord Krishna. Abhay knew, however, that he could present Bhagavad Gita in the proper spirit by writing an English commentary based on the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and the disciplic succession. So he began. Whenever he could make time, he would write. Although a strict grammarian could find fault in his English composition, his meaning was always clear. In his introduction, Abhay reflected on the time when as a young schoolboy he had attended a lecture, Vidya Ratna, the jewel of education. The theme of the lecture had been that God does not exist and could not exist. If there were God, he would certainly have appeared on earth to put an end to all religious rivalry. But since God had not obliged man in this way, we should banish all thought of his existence from our minds. The audience, Abhay explained, consisting only of so many young boys, did not dwell deeply into the subject matter of the lecture, yet the majority, impressed by arguments, carried away lofty ideas of godlessness and thus became agnostics at home. Abhay had not been satisfied with the agnostic conclusion. Because I had been trained by my father to be engaged in the worship of Sri Radha Govinda. But as a result of the Vidyaratna lecture, I was experiencing some mental conflict between agnosticism and the existence of God. Later, having heard from his spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, Abhay understood that the personality of Godhead exists in every sphere of activity. But we do not have the eyes to see him. Abhay wrote, even if the Lord personally manifests himself on earth, the quarreling mundaners will not stop their fight and look upon Godhead or his representative due to ignorance. This is the birthright of individual soul by the grace of God. Bhagavad Gita is the true jewel of of education, and in the Gita, Lord Krishna declares to the fighting people on earth, "Here I am, do not quarrel." The agnostic who had spoken of the jewel of education had been blinded by the jewel and therefore could not see and appreciate the personality of Godhead. Thus, he had gone on to convince others to become so-called jewels also. Following his spiritual master, Abhay displayed an aggressive spirit for confronting all opponents of pure theism. In responding to his spiritual master's order to develop into an English preacher, Abhay was not simply making neutral, scholarly presentations. He was willing and ready to fight, whether against modern agnostics or Vaishnavism's old traditional enemy, Mayavad impersonalism. Although few scholars taught the way of surrender to Lord Krishna as espoused in Bhagavad Gita, almost all respected Bhagavad Gita as presenting the essence of all knowledge. The Gita, therefore, was the perfect vehicle for confronting those who misrepresented God and religion. The Gita was a challenge to agnostics, apotheists, anthropomorphists, impersonalists, henotheists, pantheists, and absolute monists. Although there were already more than 600 commentators on Bhagavad Gita, they had been written by persons with an inner hatred for the personality of Godhead, and therefore they were imperfect. Such envious persons, Abhay wrote, have no entrance into the real meaning of Bhagavad Gita in as much as a fly cannot enter into the covered jar of honey. Abhay described Indian culture as an almost impassable ocean due to its depth of thought and apparent mixtures of conclusions. But in this book, Abhay declared, I will establish that Krishna is the absolute personality of Godhead by referring to the available records of scriptures, which are the recorded history of Indian culture and thought. The sannyasis at 7 Banerjee Lane were impressed by the scope of Abhay's thoughts and intentions. As it was customary to award a title to an especially worthy Vaishnava according to his qualities, Bhakti Saranga Goswami wanted to confer upon Abhay the title Bhakti Siddhanta. Sridhar Maharaj, however, thought it inappropriate to give Abhay the same title as their spiritual master, and he asked that Abhay's title be changed to Bhakti Vedanta. Bhakti means devotion. Vedanta means the end of knowledge. Abhay was grateful. The title combined the devotion of religion with the scholarship of most rigorous philosophy, as passed down by the scholarly followers of Lord Chaitanya. He appreciated the sincere gesture of his godbrothers and accepted the title as a further commitment to his spiritual path of preaching Krishna consciousness. Abhay continued regularly associating with Sridhar Maharaj and discussing with him Srimad Bhagavatam. Abhay encouraged him to preach widely, although Sridhar Maharaj was admittedly more the scholar and rather shy about going out and preaching. On several occasions, Abhay tried to convince Sridhar Maharaj to go with him and charged Gandhi and Nehru as to why they weren't following the principles of Bhagavad Gita. Another fruit of the spiritual association by 7 Banerjee Lane was a book called Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta, compiled by Sridhar Maharaj. A collection of verses from various Vaishnava scriptures, including excerpts from the works of Rupa Goswami. It was divided into 6 chapters, according to the 6 divisions of surrender. Abhay, along with the sannyasis of Devananda Saraswati Mutt, financed the publication. Thus, it was published as a joint effort by friends. September 3, 1939. Lord Linlithgow, Viceroy of India, announced that India was at war with Germany. Thus, England swept India into the war without consulting any Indians. Although independence-minded India certainly resented such a show of foreign control, there were mixed feelings about the war. India wanted independence, yet she sympathized with the Allied cause against fascism in the West and feared an invasion by impersonal Japan in the East. Since you dislike the British so violently, one author asked a typical New Delhi student of the day, would you want Japan to invade and conquer India? Student: no, but we Indians pray that God may give the British enough strength to stand up under the blows they deserve. Although at the outbreak of the war, India had only 175,000 men in her armed forces, the British managed to increase the number of Indian soldiers to 2 million. There were no draft, but the British sent recruiting agents all over India, especially in the Punjab, where military services seemed an attractive offer to the local poor. The Punjabis proved good fighters, whereas Bengalis enlisted as officers, doctors, contractors, and clerks. Indian soldiers were dispatched to battlefields in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Persia, Malaya, Burma, and Assam. While the British were attempting to mobilize Indians for the war, the Indian national movement, which had continued off and on for more than 20 years, became very active. Members of the Congress party refused to cooperate with the war effort and demanded guaranteed independence for India. Some thought that since England had her hands full with Germany, the time was ripe to revolt and gain independence by force. Gandhi's position had been one of the unconditional pacifism, and he had opposed the idea of Indians taking up arms even to defend India. But by 1942 he had become more inimical and had reduced his policy towards the British to a simple, unequivocal "Quit India". Thousands of Indians responded by chanting slogans in the streets and even by tearing up the railway lanes. Abhay's militant former schoolmate Subhash Chandra Bose fought against the British in his own way. He had approached Hitler in Germany and gotten him to agree that when the Germans captured Indian soldiers, Germany would return them to Bose, who would maintain them in his nationalist army. With this army, Bose planned to return to India and drive the British from Indian soil. But dissatisfied with his progress in Germany, Bose made a similar agreement with Toyo in Japan, and soon thousands of Gurkhas and Sikhs, the best fighters in Indian army, had defected from the British army to join Bose freedom fighters in Singapore. Bose began to prepare his army to invade India from the north. Then in 1943, the British found that the Japanese, who had already taken Burma, were at the doors of India approaching Bengal. By the tactical known as the denial policy, the British sank many Indian boats carrying food and destroyed large rice crops, fearing that they would fall into the hands of the enemy. This left local Indians starving and without the boats they needed for trade. The famine that ensued was the worst that had hit Bengal in 150 years. The government removed all control of food costs, and those who could not afford to buy at the skyrocketing prices died in the streets of Calcutta. Srila Prabhupada says, I have got experience. The government created artificial famine. The war was going on, so Mr. Churchill's policy was to keep the people in scarcity so that so they will volunteer to become soldiers. So this policy was executed. Big men, they collected the rice. Rice was selling at 6 rupee per mound. All of a sudden, it became to 50 rupee per mound. I was in the grocer store purchasing, and all of a sudden, the grocer said, No, no, I'm not going to sell anymore. At that moment, the price was 6 rupee per mound. So suddenly, he was not going to sell. A few hours later, I went back to purchase, and the rice had gone up to 50 rupee per mound. The government appointed agents began to purchase the rice and other commodities which are daily necessities. They can offer any price because the currency is in their hands. They can paint so-called papers $100 and pay. A man becomes satisfied thinking, oh, I have $100, but it is a piece of paper. That was the policy. You have no money, no rice, so another avenue is open. Yes, you can become a soldier. You get so much money. People out of poverty would go there. I have seen it. No rice was available in the market, and people were hungry. They were dying. Abhay managed to purchase just enough for his own family to survive, but he saw the beggar population increase by the hundreds. Month after month, he saw the footpaths and open spaces congested with beggars cooking their food on improvised stoves and sleeping in the open or beneath the trees. He saw starving children rummaging in the dustbins for a morsel of food. From there, it was but a step to fighting with the dogs for share of the garbage, and this also became a familiar sight in Calcutta streets. The British had little time to spare from their war efforts, and they worked only to save their lives, essential for the war. For the common people, the empire's prescription was uniform and simple: starvation. Srila Prabhupada says, one American gentleman was present at that time. He remarked, people are starving in this way. In our country, there would have been revolution. Yes, but the people of India are so trained that in spite of artificial famine, they did not commit theft, stealing, other property. People were dying. Still they thought, all right, God has given. That was the basic principle of Vedic civilization. Abhay knew that under the law of nature, there was no scarcity. By God arrangement, the earth could produce enough food. The trouble was man's greed. There is no scarcity in the world. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati had said, the only scarcity is of Krishna consciousness. And this was how Abhay saw the 1943 famine. Now, more than ever, the spiritual vision was relevant. Krishna consciousness was the prime necessity. How else could man be checked from his evil propensities to become greedy, hoard, make war, and thus create misery for millions? He had seen the heinous activities of the British in India, their cutting off the thumbs of the weavers so that Indian made cotton goods could not compete with the foreign made cloth, their shooting down of unarmed innocent citizens, their creating artificial famine, their propagating the myth that Indian civilization was primitive. Still, he did not believe that an independent Indian government would necessarily be an improvement unless the leadership was Krishna conscious, and neither Gandhi nor Subhash Chandra Bose was, then the government would be able to provide no real solutions, only stop-gap measures. Without obedience to the laws of God, as expressed by the scriptures and sages, governments would only increase human suffering. Then Calcutta was bombed day after day. The bombing was concentrated in specific areas such as Kittapur Port Facility and Sham Bazar in North Calcutta, very near Abhay's home at Sita Kant Banerjee Lane. American planes had been leaving from airfields near Calcutta for targets in China and Japan, so the air raids on Calcutta seemed an inevitable retaliation. It was Japanese striking back. Or was it? Some said it was the forces of Subhash Chandra Bose, since the bombs fell mostly in the European quarter. But for the people of Calcutta, it made little difference who was attacking. After the first bombing, people evacuated the city. Blackouts were imposed, and at night the entire city was dark. The Prabhupada says, the whole Calcutta became vacant. Perhaps only myself and a few others remained. I sent my sons to Navadvip. Of course, my daughter was married. My wife refused to go out of Calcutta. She said, I'll be bombed, but I will not go. So I had to remain in Calcutta. I have seen bombing in Calcutta all night. I was just eating when there was the siren. So the arrangement was that in your house would be the shelter room. I was hungry, so I first finished eating. Then I went to the room and bombing began. Chi, Khyam. I was thinking that this was also Krishna in another form, but that form was not very lovable. In the midst of these calamities, Abhay felt more than ever the need to propagate Krishna consciousness. He had something to say to the war-weary citizens of the world, and he longed for a more effective forum, a publication of some kind, a way to present the world's crisis through the eyes of scripture in the same bold style as had his spiritual master. There was no shortage of ideas, and he had been saving money from his business for this very purpose. Yet how could he dare produce such a journal when even learned sannyasis, senior disciples of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, were not? He never considered himself a great scholar among his god brothers. Although they called him Kavi and now Bhaktivedanta, as a Grihastha he wasn't expected to take the lead or publish his own journal. But times had changed. The English journal, The Harmonist, had not been published since before Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's passing away. Now almost a decade had passed, and the Gaudiya Math had been too busy fighting in the court to consider preaching. Long gone was the tireless spirit that for 10 consecutive years had produced the daily Nadia Prakasha. No longer were four separately located printing presses pumping out transcendental literature under the direction of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's empowered son. The presses had been sold by Kunja Bihari. Times had changed. The Gaudiya Math was only fighting, while the non-devotees were killing each other in the world war. From his front room at 6 Sita Kant Banerjee, Abhay conceived, wrote, edited, and typed the manuscript for a magazine. He designed a logo, a long rectangle across the top of the page. In the upper left-hand corner was a figure of Lord Chaitanya, effulgent like rays of light, like rays from the sun. In the lower right were silhouettes of a crowd of people in darkness but groping to receive light from Lord Chaitanya. And between Lord Chaitanya and the people, the title unfurled like a banner, Back to Godhead. In the lower right corner was a picture of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, seated at his writing, looking up thoughtfully as he composed. Above the logo ran the motto, Godhead is light, nescience is darkness. Where there is Godhead, there is no nescience. Below the logo were the following lines, edited and founded, under the direct order of His Divine Grace Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada by Mr. Abhay Charan De. Abhay had already gained some printing experience in connection with his business, and after completing the manuscript, he brought it to Saraswati Press, the best printers in Bengal. He also hired an agent, Calcutta's prestigious booksellers Thakers, Spink and Company, who would take responsibility for distributing the journal to bookstores and libraries, including outlets in several foreign countries. But when he went to buy paper, he met with government restrictions. Because of the war and subsequent paper shortage, they wanted to assay what he had written in terms of national needs during this time of world crisis, and ordinary citizens' religious newspaper was hardly top priority. Abhay's request for a paper was perfunctorily denied, but he persisted. He appealed that using paper to print the teachings of the personality of Godhead was not a waste and not untimely in the present troubled atmosphere. Finally, he obtained permission to print his first edition of Back to Godhead, a 44-page publication. Abhay Charan greeted his readers by defining his motto, Godhead is light, nescience is darkness. When man forgets that he is the son of Godhead and identifies himself with the body, then he is in ignorance. He is like a man who is very concerned with the automobile's mechanism, yet with no knowledge of the driver. The defect of the present day civilization is just like that. This is actually the civilization of nescience or illusion, and therefore civilization has been turned into militarization. Everyone is fully concerned with the comforts of the body and everything related with the body, and no one is concerned with the spirit that moves the body, although even a boy can realize that the motor car mechanism has little value if there is no driver of the car. This dangerous ignorance of humanity is a gross nescience and has created a dangerous civilization in the form of militarization. This militarization, which in softer language is nationalization, is an external barrier to understanding human relations. There is no meaning in a fight where the parties do fight only for matter of different colored dresses. There must be therefore an understanding of human relation without any consideration of bodily designation or colored dresses. Back to Godhead is a feeble attempt by the undersigned under the direction of His Divine Grace Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada, the celebrated founder and organizer of the Gaudiya Math activities, just to bring up a real relation of humanity with central relation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That there is a great and urgent need of a literature like this is keenly felt by the leaders of all countries, and the following statements will help much in the procedure. In the it was 1944, and Abhay specifically addressed the crisis of World War. The world's political leaders were expressing their disgust at their people's suffering and scarcity. After after 4 years of fighting, costing millions of human lives, the Second World War within 20 years was still scorching the earth. Although the end was in sight, leaders expressed not so much happiness and hope as weariness and uncertainty. Even if this war ended, would there be yet another war? Had man not yet grasped the vital lesson of how to live in peace? Abhay quoted the archbishops of India. India, guided by God, can lead the world back to sanity. He quoted the President of United States, a program therefore of moral rearmament for the world cannot fail to lessen the dangers of armed conflict. Such moral rearmament, to be most highly effective, must receive support on a worldwide basis. He mentioned former President Herbert Hoover, who had affirmed that the world needs to return to moral and spiritual ideas, ideals, and he quoted a resolution by the British House of Commons affirming that spiritual principles are the common heritage of all people and that men and nations urgently need to acknowledge the sovereignty of God. He quoted Wendell Willkie, who after his return from Russia had reported millions of Russians killed, wounded, or missing in the war and millions more suffering from a winter of terrible scarcity and subjugation. What is true for the Russian people, Abhay wrote, is also true for other people, and we Indians are feeling the same scarcity, the same want, the same disgust. He quoted Britain's Secretary Anthony Eden, who had been filled with lamentation and indignation at the miseries of the war. He quoted the Archbishop of Canterbury. In every quarter of earth men long to be delivered from the curse of war, and to find in a world which has regained its peace, respite from the harshness and bitterness of the world they have known till now. But so often they want the kingdom of heaven without its king, the kingdom of God without God, and they cannot have it. Our resolve must be back to God. We make plans for the future, for peace amongst the nation, and for civil security at home. That is quite right enough, and it would be wrong to neglect it. But all our plans will come to shipwreck on the rock of human selfishness unless we turn to God, back to God. That is the chief need of England and of every nation. He also quoted Sir Francis, young husband of Britain. Now that religion is everywhere attacked brutally, we look to India, the very home of religion, for a sign. And finally, he quoted Sir Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. This war, when it would be won, would prove to be the bleeding ground of other wars if the peace was not saved. It could happen only if powerful nations ceased to take pride and glory in their possessions, which were based on labor and tribute of other weaker nations. This perhaps was what Sir Harcourt Butler meant when he said the principles of Hinduism contained the essential elements for the saving of world civilization. And in another quote from Dr. Radhakrishnan, Abhay offered a statement he also used as one of the mottos of the magazine. We have to defeat tyranny in the realm of thought and create a will for world peace. Instruments for training the mind and educating human nature should be used to develop a proper social outlook, without which institutional machinery was of little use. Abhay expressed his confidence that the spiritual resources of India could be used by everyone, not only to enhance the glory of India, but to benefit the whole world. Next, he told how he had come to begin Back to Godhead magazine, how he had written a letter 2 weeks before the disappearance of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and how his spiritual master had instructed him to preach in English. Under the circumstances, since 1936 up to now, I was simply speculating whether I shall venture this difficult task, and that without any means and capacity. But as none have discouraged me, I have now taken courage to take up the work. But at the present moment, my conscience is dictating me to take up the work, although the difficulties are not over for the present situation arising out of war conditions. Abhay stated that his paper would contain only the transcendental messages of the great sages of India, especially Lord Chaitanya, and that his duty would be simply to repeat them, just like a translator. He would not manufacture anything, and so his words would descend as transcendental sound for guiding people back to Godhead. He admitted that the subject matters of Back to Godhead, being from a totally different sphere of consciousness, might seem dry to his readers, but he held that anyone who actually gave attention to his message would benefit. Sugar candy is never sweet to those who are suffering from the disease of bile, but still, sugar candy is the medicine for bilious patients. The taste of sugar candy will gradually be revived if the bilious patient goes on taking sugar candy regularly for cure of the disease. We recommend the same process to the readers of Back to Godhead. Abhay focused on printing the timeless message of the Vedas, but in the context of current crisis. In his essay, Godhead and His Potentiality, he presented Vedic evidence and logical arguments to explain the transcendental nature of Godhead and the individual souls, both being deathless, blissful, and full of knowledge. Because men have forgotten and neglected their vital connection with God, they can never be satisfied in the material world, which is temporary and beset with unavoidable miseries. As spiritual souls, everyone is eternal by nature, and therefore everyone tries to avoid the onslaught of distresses and dangers which come one after another. But the material body is meant for suffering and ultimately for destruction. The exodus of the residents of Calcutta to other places out of fear of being raided by Japanese bombs is due to the same tendency of non destructible existence. But those who are thus going away do not remember that even after going away from Calcutta, saved from the raids of Japanese bombs, they are unable to protect their bodies as non-destructible in any part of material universe, when the same bodies will be raided by the bombs of material nature in the form of threefold miseries. The Japanese also, who are threatening the Calcutta people with ruthless air raids for increasing their own happiness by possession of lands, do not know that their happiness is also temporary and destructible, as they have repeatedly experienced in their own fatherland. The living beings, on the other hand, who are designed to be killed, are by nature eternal, impenetrable, invisible, etc. So all these living entities who are threatened to be killed, as well as those who are threatening to conquer, are all alike in the grip of the Maya potency and are therefore in the darkness. Abhay wrote that never by their own devices could men escape the conditions of destruction. So many world leaders were seeking relief from the war, but all were useless, because their attempts for peace were within the material conception of life. Their attempts were like the attempts to alleviate darkness with darkness. But darkness can be removed only by light. Without light, any amount of speculation of human mind, which is also a creation of material nature, can never restore the living entities to permanent happiness. In that darkness, any method of bringing peace in the world can bring only temporary relief or distress, as we can see from all creations of the external potency. In darkness, non-violence is as much useless as violence, while in the light, there is no need of violence or non-violence. Abhay did not deal exclusively with the war. In Theosophy, in Theosophy Ends in Vaishnavism, he criticized the shortcomings of fashionable ideas of philosophy, which the followers of Madame Blavatsky had popularized in India. In congregational chanting, he upheld the scriptural prediction that the Sankirtan movement of Lord Chaitanya would spread to every town and village on the surface of earth. From this foretelling, we can hope that the cult of Sankirtan will take very shortly a universal form of religious movement, and this universal religion, wherein there is no harm in chanting the name of the Lord, nor is there any question of quarrel, will continue for years, as we can know from the pages of authoritative scripture. The central theme of Back to Godhead was clearly the order of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. In its cover with its picture of a thoughtful Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, in its dedication, in its statement of magazine's purpose, in its handling of issues, its analysis of theosophy, its prediction of the spread of Sankirtan, in its every aspect, the theme of Back to Godhead was the order of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. There were also four shorter essays by other contributors, including Bhakti Saranga Goswami. An advertisement on the back cover highlighted, Gita-Upanishad by Abhay Charan De, editor and founder, Back to Godhead, in 3 parts, 1200 pages, royal size, first class, Morocco binding. An elaborate exposition of the world famous Hindu philosophy, the Bhagavad Gita, in its true scientific, theistic interpretations by the chain of disciplic succession from Sri Krishna, Brahma, Narada, Vyasa, Madhva, Madhavendra, Puri, Ishvara, Lord Chaitanya, Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, Krishnadas, Narottam, Vishwanath, Valadeva, Valadev, Jagannath, Thakur, Bhakti Vinod, Gaur Kishore, Thakur Siddhanta, Saraswati, down to the author, with numerous illustrations in colors and plain from many authentic scriptures. To be published shortly. Customers book in advance. Price rupees 18. Foreign £1 10 cents. And a second major work, Lord Chaitanya, in 2 parts, totaling 1000 pages. Neither of these manuscripts were actually near completion, but Abhay was expressing his eagerness to undertake such large works on behalf of his spiritual master. In attempting to print the second issue of Back to Godhead, Abhay encountered the same difficulty as before. Twice he requested permission to purchase newsprint, and twice the government denied his request. Paper was restricted on account of war. In July 10, 1944, Abhay wrote a third letter. With due respect, I beg to submit that under the instruction of His Divine Grace, Śrīla Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Maharaj, the spiritual head of Gaudiya Vaishnava, I had to start a paper under the caption Back to Godhead. The very name will suggest the intention of starting such a paper in the midst of heavy turmoil through which the world is now passing. A copy of same booklet is sent herewith for your kind perusal. In that booklet, you shall find strong world opinions, even by many reputed politicians all over the world, in favor of such a movement to bring back the world into sanity by training the mind and educating human nature for the unshaking spiritual plane, considered to be the supreme need of humankind. I hope you will kindly go through the paper by making some time, and I may draw your attention specifically to the introductory portion. Abhay also remarked that the editorial board of Back to Godhead felt that there was not so much a scarcity of paper as a scarcity of education. Taking the opportunity to preach, Abhay explained that although the ultimate supplier was the personality of Godhead, godless men considered themselves the proprietors of all things. Catastrophe that is now in vogue in present war of supremacy is guided by this false sense of proprietorship, and therefore there is need of many propaganda amongst all human beings in order to bring them back to the sense of ultimate proprietorship of Godhead. Abhay conceded that there might indeed be a paper shortage in India, but in ancient times, he wrote, enlightened Indians had regularly sacrificed tons of valuable ghee and grains in the fire during religious sacrifices, and in those times there had not been any scarcity. People now, however, have abandoned all sacrifices to the Supreme Lord, were producing only scarcity. Can we not, therefore, sacrifice a few realms of papers in the midst of many wastages for the same purpose in order to derive greater benefit for the mankind? I request that the government should take up this particular case in the light of spiritualism, which is not within the material calculation. Even in Great Britain, the government has immensely supported a similar movement called the Moral Rearmament Movement without consideration of scarcity of paper, which is more acute there than here. Let there be a page only, if not more, for publication of Back to Godhead, for which we do not mind, but my earnest request is that the government should at least let there be a ventilation of the atmosphere for which my paper Back to Godhead is meant. Kindly, therefore, give it a serious consideration and allow me to start even by one page every week or monthly as you think best, without thinking it as ordinary waste of paper, for the sake of humanity and Godhead. The letter was successful. Now, with wild sarcasm, he headlined his second edition, Thanks to the Government of India. He informed his readers, many of whom had been disappointed to learn that the government had curtailed his printing, that he would be able to continue his magazine every month. Abhay printed his letter to the government paper officer and also the reply granting him permission. His articles were shorter, this time displaying the flair of a news columnist as with philosophical criticism, verve, and a touch of ironic humor he commented on world leaders and crises. Gandhi Jinnah talks, Mr. Churchill's humane world, Mr. Bernard Shaw's wishful desire, and spontaneous love of Godhead comprise the issue. Gandhi Jinnah talks. We are sorry to learn that Gandhi Jinnah talks about unity of Indian people have failed for the present. Abhay was not very optimistic about the results of such occasional talks between several heads of communities. Even if they made a successful solution, it would break up and take the shape of another problem. They were looking for unity between Muslims and Hindus, but in Europe, the fighting parties were Christians, and in Asia, they were almost Buddhists. But still, they were fighting. So, fighting will go on between Hindus and Mohammedans, between Hindus and Hindus, or between Mohammedans and Mohammedans, between Christians, and between Buddhists and Buddhists till the day of annihilation. As long as there was the contaminated self interest of sense gratification, there would be fighting between brother and brother, father and son, nation and nation. Real unity would stand only on a plane of transcendental service to the Supreme. Mahatma Gandhi, Abhay wrote, is far above ordinary human being and we have all respect for him. But Abhay advised Gandhi to give up his activities on the material plane and rise to the transcendental plane of the spirit. Then there could be talks about the unity of all people. Abhay cited Bhagavad Gita's definition of a Mahatma, one who concentrates his attention on the service of the Supreme Lord Krishna, Sri Krishna. He requested Mahatma Gandhi to adhere to the teachings of Bhagavad Gita and preach its message of surrender to the Supreme Personality of Godhead Sri Krishna. In this way, Mahatma Gandhi, through his influential position in the world, could bring about universal relief simply by the preaching the message of Bhagavad Gita. Mr. Churchill's human world. We are pleased to find that leaders of the world politics such as Mr. Churchill have nowadays begun to think of a human world and trying to get rid of terrible national frenzy of hate. The frenzy of hatred is another side of frenzy of love. The frenzy of love of Hitler's own countrymen has produced the concomitant frenzy of hatred for others, and the present war is the result of such dual side of a frenzy called love and hatred. So when we wish to get rid of frenzy of hate, we must be prepared to get rid of frenzy of so-called love. This position of equilibrium free from love and hatred is attained only when men are sufficiently educated. Until men were educated to see the soul within the body, the dual frenzy of love and hate would continue and a human world would not be possible. This introspection, Abhay concluded, is as easily attained by by the service of Godhead. So Mr. Churchill's human world implies that we must go back to Godhead. Mr. Bernard Shaw's wishful desire. Mr. Bernard Shaw has congratulated Mahatma Gandhi on the occasion of later 76th birthday in the following words. I can only wish this were Mr. Gandhi's 35th birthday instead of his 76th. We heartily join with Mr. Shaw in his attempt to subtract 41 years from the present age of Mahatma Gandhi. But death does not respect our wishful desire. Neither Mr. Shaw nor Mahatma Gandhi nor any other great personality had ever been able to solve the problem of death. The leaders of nations have opened many factories for manufacturing weapons for the art of killing, but none has opened a factory to manufacture weapons for protecting man from the cruel hands of death. Although our wishful desire is always not to die. Men were preoccupied with the problem of how to get bread, although his problem was actually solved by nature. Man should try to solve the problem of death. Bhagavad Gita tells that the problem of death can be solved, although death is everywhere in the material world. One who attains to me, says Krishna, never has to take his birth again in the material world. There is spiritual world, not destructible, and one who goes there does not come back to the region of death. Why should the leaders of nations cling to the planet of their birth, where death is inevitable? Abhay concluded, we wish that in their ripe old age, Mr. Shah and Mahatma Gandhi will make combined effort to educate men to learn how to back to home, back to Godhead. After two issues of Back to Godhead, Abhay had to stop. Printing was costly, but he kept writing regularly, working at Gita Upanishad, turning out new articles and philosophical purports on the scriptures, even in the same book in which he wrote his pharmaceutical formulas. One night Abhay had an unusual dream. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta appeared before him, beckoning. He was asking Abhay to leave home and take sannyas. Abhay awoke in an intensely emotional state. How horrible, he thought. He knew it was not an ordinary dream, yet the request seemed so difficult and unlikely. Take sannyas. At least it was not something he could do immediately. Now he had to improve the business, and with profits he would print books. He went on with his duties, but remained shaken by the dream. In 1945, the war over and India still in the turmoil under British rule. Abhay saw a good opportunity to make his business more successful. In Lucknow, 600 miles from Calcutta, he rented a building and opened his own factory, Abhay Charan De and Sons. It was a major investment requiring 40,000 rupees to start, and he began on larger scale than ever before, asking also according to law to ensure that he was not dealing in the black market or misusing chemicals. He had to employ three government inspectors. Yet despite a high overhead, he established a good market and his products were in demand. He closed his small operation in Calcutta and concentrated on the Lucknow business. Although the building was known locally to be haunted by ghosts, Abhay had not been deterred. But when he began his operation, some of the workers came to him frightened. Babu, Babu, there is a ghost. Abhay then went through the entire building chanting Hare Krishna, and after that there were no more complaints of ghosts. On November 13, Abhay wrote to his servant Gauranga, mentioning some of his difficulties in Lucknow and asking him to come there to help. In this letter, Abhay spoke bitterly of his wife Radharani and children. Gauranga Prabhu, please accept my humble obeisances. Please accept my obeisances. I received your letter dated 7th. Due to lack of time, I could not reply in time. I stay here alone with some servants. If I leave now, then I have to close everything down. Due to my leaving once and closing the business, I have lost about 10,000 rupees, and the goodwill has also been affected, and my enemies have increased. That is why I am fighting, practically staking my whole life. I am staying here all alone in the middle of so many difficulties, not for nothing. That's why I was writing to you repeatedly to come here. As soon as you receive this letter, show it to Dabra. Take at least 10 rupees from him and come here. When you come here, I will make arrangements to send money to your home. What's the point in holding you back with an excuse that there is no servant or maidservant? I try to serve them enough by keeping servants, maidservants, and cooks, but up until today they have not become attached to devotional service. So I am no more interested about those affairs. When you come here, then I will go to Calcutta. If I see that they are interested about devotional service, then only will I maintain my establishment there. Otherwise, I will not maintain them anymore. Bring a quilt for me. Your Abhay. Yours Abhay. The two interests, family and preaching, were conflicting. Radharani had never shown any interest in Back to Godhead. She seemed to work against his enthusiasm, both for publishing and for earning. The business was called Abhay Charan De and Sons, and yet the sons were disciplined to help. And when he had called for his servant to join him in Lucknow, the family had objected, saying they needed Gaurang more there. What was the use? The family was interested neither in backing him in his business, nor in taking up the life of devotional service. And since his business was primarily an outcome of his family life, he resented that he had to give it so much of his energy. It was the old economic law by martial that he had learned in college. Without family affection, a man's economic impetus is weakened. Of course, there could be a compatible balance between family service and devotional service. Bhaktivinoda Thakur had described two simultaneous obligations, bodily and spiritual. Social status, mental development, cleanliness, nourishment, and the struggle for existence were all bodily obligations. The activities of devotional service to Krishna were spiritual, and the two should parallel one another. In Bhakti Vinod Thakur's life, his family was a source of spiritual encouragement, and he used his social position to advance his preaching. But Abhay's experience had been different. The two paths seemed to be at war, each threatening the other's existence. He felt himself operating somewhat like the materialists he had criticized in his writings, absorbed in the struggle for existence with insufficient time for self-realization. Although his family made more and more demands of him, he was feeling less inclined to work for them and more inclined to preach Krishna consciousness. It was a predicament. He could only push on diligently, support his family, expand his business, and hope for a great success so that he could revive his publishing. But the Lucknow factory seemed almost beyond his means. He had purposely begun on a large scale with the aim of making a larger profit, but monthly expenses were high. He had fallen behind in his rent, and now he was involved in a court case with the landlord. Although he was visiting Calcutta regularly and shipping raw material from Calcutta to Lucknow daily, he always found his family members in Calcutta uncooperative. His servant Gaurang was also reluctant to work as Abhay required and was thinking of going back to live with his family. Abhay again wrote to Gaurang on the 23rd, offering my humble obeisances at the feet of the Vaishnava. Gaurang Prabhu, I have received your postcard dated 18/11/45 and got all the information. There is no need to come here just for a month after spending the money and then go back. For the present, take 25 rupees from Dubra and go home. Write a letter to me after your arrival. Then I will send the rest of your money in 1 or 2 installments by money order. Then from there, you let me know when you can come here. I have started my work here in a fairly big scale. You have seen that with your own eyes. So if there is no income, who will spend? For a court interrogation. Everything is on my head. The brother and sons are just eating and sleeping like a bunch of females and breaking the axe on my head. You go home as soon as you get the money and try to come back as soon as possible. Yours Sri Abhay Charan De. Hare Krishna. I don't know if you're able to hear. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji. Thank you, Prabhuji. It was very nice. Yeah, felt the struggle that Prabhupada did in his life at that moment.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean to still meet time because last time session was very long, right? So I was leading little fast. I don't know. At least when there was main messages of Prabhupada, which are need to be highlighted for ourselves, I was going a little slow, but still, yeah. So if you could follow.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, very nice Prabhuji, very, very good actually. So the time we even did not thought the time as fast passing so fast with this this flow of the life of Prabhupada, so blissful.
Was it able to? I mean, with the speed, is it still followable?
I think for me it was okay. Yes.
Yeah. While I was reading, I was always having this in the background, back of my mind.
Yes. For me, Prabhuji, it was okay. This speed. Yes. Yeah. Maybe others can also give their feedback, but yeah. And Prabhuji, about the Mahatma Gandhi, actually, yeah, it is really it's described quite good. So I remember now today that I think it may be around 10 years or so. We were in Radha Desh temple, and we listened the same Bhagavad Gita class from one very